Can I build a shrimp tank without spending any money? I've been keeping blue dream shrimp for over 2 years now, but for the past couple of months they had to live in a bucket of shame. Needless to say, they are in need of a proper home. However, I didn't want to spend any money on this project, so I'm going to try to make this tank entirely with scraps from other projects. And for the tank itself, I'm tearing down the Legend of Zelda terrarium. I was really happy with this setup initially, but it has clearly seen better days, and thus I decided to take this one down to make room for something new. There's a lot of silicone to clean up here, but if I'm being careful, I might not need to reseal the tank. Once I got this thing cleaned up, I filled the tank up with water and left it overnight. Since there weren't any leaks visible the next day, I could move on to the next step. This is a rimless tank, and thus a foam mat is needed to make up for any inconsistencies between the tank and the shelf it will be placed on. And to make things easier, I attached this to the base of the tank using double-sided tape. And now it's time for the fun part, creating a background. To do this, I have a few different materials to work with. These include a cork round, Oko dragonstone, spiderwood and some cocoa fiber liner. I ended up not using the cocoa fiber, but it's a good idea to test out different materials. I like to start out with the biggest items to get a rough idea and then fill in the rest with smaller pieces. And after playing around with the cork, I quickly decided it would look way better if I cut the cork in half, so I had 2 separate pieces to use. I then added some dragonstone that I strategically placed in such a way as to avoid showing the old foam residue that was previously used to hold this in place. The look I'm going for is a riverbed that has been slowly eroding away, exposing the hard rocky surface and roots from plants up above. To further that look, I'm also weaving in some pieces of spiderwood. And eventually I ended up with this, which I'm very happy with, so I slowly took everything back out and started applying expanding foam. As I'm placing everything back into the foam, you can clearly see just how much this stuff expands. And by the time it's done expanding, it's pretty obvious I applied way too much. About half an hour later, the foam isn't fully cured yet, but it has lost most of its stickiness, so I went back in to press as much of the foam back down as possible to avoid carving later on. And a few hours later the foam had fully cured, so now it's time to make it look seamless. To achieve the seamless look, I apply a little bit of super glue over any exposed area of expanding foam and cover it in place sand.
By the way, this is your reminder to like and subscribe.
I got a little bit cold in my workshop, so I decided to finish making the background inside. This included gluing more sand to the background as well as breaking off a piece of one of the cork rounds. I then took this thing to my bathroom and washed off any debris that may be present. And then took it back to the workshop to paint the outside black so I could hide all the foam. And while the paint is drying, it's time to prepare the substrate. But I don't want to use any old aqua soil. I want to make a dirted tank. I've been reading the ecology of the plant aquarium as well as researching dirted tanks on YouTube, and I want to give it a go myself. I began sifting some topsoil to remove sticks and other big items and ended up with this. The next day I could move the tank to its final location and start adding some sand. I didn't add too much just yet and pushed everything I added to the edges of the tank, so when I add my topsoil, you won't see any layers on the outside of the tank. I then sprayed some water into the tank to turn the dirt into mud, and thus make sure there weren't any air bubbles trapped in the soil. I then kept the soil with some more sand, after which it was time to start adding the plants. And I began by adding the terrestrial plants first. To keep most of these in place, I placed their roots between 2 layers of filter sponge and wedged them in various spots throughout the hardscape. Others, like the syngonium, I superglued directly to the hardscape. With these plants in place, I used pieces of moss to hide any remaining foam and pieces of sponge. All of these plants will help filter the water. Their foliage will be located above the waterline, while their roots will be submerged in the water, thus creating the perfect natural filter. It's starting to look really great, but the water column is still completely empty. So I began by adding 2 little crypts, followed by 2 stems of hydrocodal. And no aquatic setup is complete without a few anubias peppered throughout the setup. These were all super glued directly to the hardscape. And finally I added a bunch of stems of Rotala runtifolia. All of the plants I use come from various propagation bins and are still extremely small. Given enough time though, they will slowly create a lush forest as the tank matures. To get the full jungle look I'm going for, I'm also adding leaf litter. These were pulled directly from my pond outside and should be riddled with beneficial bacteria. And I also added some botanicals like these cool seed pods. A couple of days later, the water has gone brown and cloudy. And honestly, I expected this to happen. Probably there are some leaves in there or some of the seed pods that I didn't boil long enough. They released some tannins into the water, staining it brown. Now, as for the cloudiness, this is really common with dirted tanks. I've never set up a dirted tank before, but I read about it, I watched some videos about it, so I know it's pretty common for this to happen within the first couple of days after setting it up. That said, we're not gonna wait until it disappears on its own. We're gonna do a 100% water change before we introduce the animals.
Why is everything wet? Why is everything wet? Whoa, that's a lot of water. God damn it. Just act like nothing happened.
Another couple of days later, I feel confident this system can handle livestock. The full stocking of this tank includes 12 blue dream shrimp, 2 amano shrimp, 6 assassin snails and 2 chili rasbora. The cool thing about this stocking is that all of these animals were in the original iteration of this setup, as well as most of the hardscape elements. It's really cool to see how different these 2 tanks look, even though they consist of pretty much all the same materials. But I definitely prefer the new setup. It has a ton of growing in to do, especially in the water portion, and will without a doubt look completely different in a couple of months. And by that time I'll definitely update you guys. In the meantime, I recommend you go watch this video next to get the full story of my spotted turtle Koa. I'll see you there.